I'm Richard P. Smith. What I've got behind me here is a nice 4.5-year-old buck. He's got a nice 130 class 8-point rack. I've known this deer since he was a fawn, and I've been able to walk with him all that time. I'm filming this buck in a park in my hometown where there's no hunting, but these are free-ranging deer. I've learned a lot by being able to walk with deer like this buck and others that have gotten to be 3 and 4 years old. It's really an eye-opener to be able to walk with deer and see what they do, to have insights like I've learned by walking with bucks like this one. As an avid deer hunter and outdoor writer, I've always been interested in finding ways to learn as much as possible about white-tailed deer and at the same time capture unique photographs and video of the animals. More than 20 years ago, I discovered that I could gain the trust of whitetails in park settings where they aren't hunted, and they would allow me to follow them to observe and photograph what they did. By walking with whitetails, I've been able to gain insights into the behavior and life history of these animals that very few, if any, other people have. I've also been able to capture some unique photos and video of their behavior that most people have never seen. Until recently, I didn't realize how valuable my observations, photos, and video could be in shedding light on the primary ways that chronic wasting disease, otherwise known as CWD, is transmitted between deer. Based on my many years of walking with whitetails, it's clear to me that the close social contact that whitetail family members share throughout their lives and the social bonds that form among members of bachelor groups of bucks play an important role in spreading CWD. The breeding behavior of whitetails, however, contributes even more to the spread of the disease due to the intimate contact bucks of all ages have with multiple does every fall. This is why adult bucks routinely have the highest prevalence of CWD and other diseases such as tuberculosis or TB. Take a look at some of the photos and video that I've captured over the years while walking with whitetails that shows the most likely ways that diseases such as CWD are transmitted among deer. Genetic testing of whitetails that have CWD in Michigan has confirmed that diseased does infect their offspring. If fawns don't have the disease when they are born, they have an excellent chance of contracting CWD from their mothers due to the close social contact they have on a daily basis. Does and their fawns engage in mutual grooming, which often involves nose-to-nose contact multiple times during the course of each day. The prions that cause CWD may also be in the milk that nursing does produce. If that is the case, that's certainly another way that diseased does can infect their offspring with CWD. I don't know that the presence of prions in milk has been confirmed by research, but I do know research has confirmed the presence of CWD causing prions in other body fluids such as blood, saliva, and urine. It wouldn't be a surprise if prions are also in a mother's milk. Mutual grooming is a behavior that does engage in with their offspring throughout their lives. They continue this close social contact when the opportunity presents itself. This is most common among a doe and her daughters because the home ranges of does and their daughters often overlap. I've observed old does as much as 15 or 16 years old mutually grooming with their adult daughters that were more than 10 years old. Adult does also have close social contact with fawns born to their daughters, engaging in mutual grooming with their granddaughters and grandsons. After fawns are more than a month old, it's common for older does and her fawns to spend time with her adult daughters and her fawns. This clip shows an adult doe with 4 fawns. 2 of them are hers and the other two belong to her daughter, which is off camera. Something I have observed among family groups of whitetails that I have followed most closely is that does and their adult daughters will often babysit each other's fawns. Here's an older doe with two of her fawns, and the third fawn belongs to her daughter. So she's babysitting. Here's a photo of an old doe engaged in mutual grooming with a grandson that's more than a year old. If this doe's fawns had survived, she wouldn't have tolerated the presence of this yearling buck. But because she lost her fawns, the bond between them strengthened. They spent spring, summer, and fall together. Siblings routinely engage in mutual grooming too, throughout their lives. This occurs most frequently among sisters, since they are most likely to have overlapping home ranges, but it also occurs between brothers and sisters. This photo shows a brother and sister engaged in mutual grooming at 4 years old. Fawns often have nose-to-nose contact with unrelated deer too. When fawns are old enough to start traveling with their mothers and they encounter deer unfamiliar to the fawns, the young deer will often sniff noses with the strangers as a form of greeting. Here are two photos showing what I'm talking about. The first photo shows a fawn born in June on the left that has already lost its spots, sniffing noses with a fawn born during August. The second photo shows a yearling buck sniffing noses with a fawn. Bucks often form social bonds as part of bachelor groups during spring, summer, and early fall. These bucks that spend a lot of time together frequently mutually groom one another, and it's common for them to have nose-to-nose contact like these two. Even during the fall, after the antlers of bucks have fully developed and the velvet has been removed, bucks will mutually groom one another, increasing the opportunity for nose-to-nose contact. And it's common for these grooming sessions to turn into sparring matches, as shown here. As you will see here in this clip, there's plenty of opportunity for nose-to-nose contact when bucks are sparring too. So at this point, it should be abundantly clear that the tendency of whitetails to engage in mutual grooming with family members and for bucks to engage in the practice with unrelated males as members of bachelor groups facilitates the spread of disease due to the social nature of whitetails. Behavior associated with breeding brings even greater risk of becoming infected, especially for bucks. Bucks engage in risky behavior during the rut that increases their chances of becoming infected if they interact with a doe that has CWD. And no, I'm not talking about the actual mating process. It's all the other behavior associated with it that I'm talking about. Since adult bucks that are a year and a half old and older interact with multiple does during the breeding season, the odds of them becoming infected are high. That's why adult bucks usually have a higher prevalence of disease than does. During the breeding season, bucks are repeatedly exposed to urine from multiple does. Whenever and wherever bucks encounter urine deposited by does, they smell and lick the liquid to determine a doe's breeding status. When bucks are pursuing does in the hopes of breeding them, does will frequently stop and urinate, as shown here. Bucks then stop to taste the urine to determine the doe's breeding status. After licking the urine, bucks raise their upper lip in what's called a lip curl as they assess the doe's breeding status from her urine. Here's a better view of a buck sampling the urine deposited by a doe and then performing a lip curl. Bucks sample the urine from does hundreds, if not thousands of times every fall, repeatedly exposing themselves to disease. Once a doe is ready to breed, bucks frequently lick the tarsal glands on the hind legs of does, which is a gland does frequently urinate on. Here's a closer view of a buck licking the tarsal gland of a doe before breeding. Bucks also repeatedly lick the rear of does, as shown here, further exposing themselves to disease. And bucks lick the mouths of does too, in direct nose-to-nose contact, increasing the risk of disease transmission from the buck to the doe or the doe to the buck. Diseased bucks can also infect other bucks by way of their mucus or saliva. As part of rutting behavior, bucks rub their antlers on saplings. Bucks almost always lick the scarred saplings they rub their antlers on, and they certainly put their noses up next to those saplings. Other bucks sometimes rub and lick the same saplings, sometimes minutes later, as shown here. Bucks also mouth branches above pod patches of ground called scrapes. Multiple bucks that visit those scrapes mouth the same branches. When bucks are sparring, they often have nose-to-nose contact too. Yearling bucks like this spikhorn, which is just licked the urine deposited by a doe, are just as susceptible to CWD as older bucks because they exhibit the same rutting behavior. Here's another spikhorn attempting to spar with a bedded 9-pointer and having direct nose-to-nose contact with that older buck. Yearling bucks play a greater role in each fall's breeding season than most people realize. Here's still another spikhorn chasing a doe that's in heat. And here's a 3-pointer that I filmed breeding this doe a number of times. Yearling bucks that aren't infected with CWD during the rut could have been infected by their mothers through direct nose-to-nose contact. And that's why mandatory antler point restrictions are not compatible with managing the disease, because mandatory APR protects the majority of yearling bucks. And the greatest danger from yearling bucks is they're known dispersers. They travel outside their mother's home range and can spread the disease into new areas. Comparing the experiences between Missouri and Pennsylvania serve as an excellent example of the dangers of mandatory antler point restrictions when it comes to managing chronic wasting disease. Missouri had mandatory antler point restrictions, but once they recognized the disease, they suspended those regulations. As of April of 2019, they only had 116 cases of deer with the disease. Pennsylvania, on the other hand, has mandatory antler point restrictions, and as of April of 2019, they had more than 300 cases of the disease identified. More than 200 were in free-ranging deer, and 100 of those were in captive deer. Use of bait by deer hunters is often blamed for spreading diseases such as CWD due to alleged nose-to-nose contact between deer that occurs at these feeding sites. I think this speculation is fostered by Michigan State University study done years ago. During this study, students counted the number of times the nose from one deer was within a certain distance of another deer. A major flaw in this study is there was no attempt to determine the relationship between whitetails that fed close to one another, which in most cases would be does, their fawns, and possibly other family members. It's not unusual to see a doe at a bait with her fawns and yearlings. Based on my more than 50 years of deer hunting, I can assure you that any deer feeding at a bait site that were close enough to have nose-to-nose contact were related, like this doe and her 2 fawns. and share much more intimate nose-to-nose contact as part of their daily social interactions, as I've shared with you on this video. Based on my many years of observations while hunting over bait, whitetails will simply not tolerate an unrelated animal in close proximity while feeding at a bait. Any unrelated deer that attempt to approach or feed are chased away, as shown here. A fawn that's not related to the other deer snuck in the front of this bait until the adult doe noticed it was an unrelated animal and chased it off. Any potential threat of disease transmission at bait sites, especially in Michigan, where hunters are limited to the use of 2 gallons of bait per day that is spread over a minimum of 100 square feet, is at a much lower threshold than the normal social behavior of whitetails. The fact that CWD prevalence is high in parts of western states, such as Wyoming and Colorado, where baiting is not existent, confirms that. So does the fact that CWD is present in a state like Minnesota, where baiting has been illegal for many years. When single bite baits such as kernel corn are used, the odds of disease transmission at bait sites where the quantity of bait is limited are minimal when compared to the normal social interactions of whitetails. And even with apples, which often require more than one bite from deer to consume, are most often entirely eaten by one whitetail. Here is a video of a pair of related does eating apples fallen from a tree. Certainly, baiting deer with apples can't be any more risky than deer eating apples that have fallen to the ground from Michigan's many apple trees. The greatest risk of disease transmission from baiting is when multiple bite baits such as sugar beets, pumpkins, carrots, and cabbage are used. Those types of baits increase the chances that healthy whitetails could come in contact with saliva from an infected deer. The danger of unnecessary restrictions on deer baiting when it comes to controlling the spread of disease is those restrictions reduce hunting effort and success along with the harvest of whitetails. Methods that increase hunter success in harvest, such as baiting with single bite baits that minimize the risk of spreading disease, are important to help control or reduce the spread of CWD. I hope this video helps put the risks of baiting in terms of disease transmission in proper perspective when compared to the normal social interactions that occur among whitetails on a daily basis. It's important to keep in mind that any nose-to-nose contact that takes place at deer baits are almost always between deer that are related and that share much more intimate contact between one another during their normal daily social interactions. As this video should make clear, the primary ways that diseases such as CWD are transmitted among deer are through frequent social contact, such as grooming and behavior associated with the breeding season. Since does that have CWD can and do infect their fawns with a disease, yearling bucks are just as susceptible to CWD as older bucks during the breeding seasons, and yearling bucks pose the greatest risk of spreading disease to new areas when they disperse. Implementation of mandatory anti-point restrictions won't work to control spread of the disease. It's essential for hunters to have the option of shooting whitetails of either sex in all age classes in order to have a chance of reducing the spread of CWD among deer. Regulations that allow and even encourage hunters to shoot members of family groups would be most beneficial.